I will tell you about the day a dead ship came back to the edge of known space, and what it cost the man inside it to make the trip. First, I have to tell you about the ambush. You can't understand the rest without it. We were 3 days out of Heldra Station, running a standard border sweep along the Vethara exclusion corridor. My ship was the Ardent Lance, a mid-class patrol frigate, not large by any measure that matters, but solid, reliable. The kind of vessel they give a new commander when they want to see what he's made of before they trust him with anything heavier. I had 17 crew, a working sensor array, 2 forward railgun clusters, and a captain named Marcus Riker who had been patrolling this corridor since before I was born. He was my father's oldest friend. After my father died, work accident, nothing dramatic, nothing worth a story. Marcus had looked after me the way a man does when a promise is owed, pushed my application to the Frontier Service. He vouched for my posting. He asked specifically to have me assigned to his vessel when I made lieutenant grade, which meant I served under the man who taught me everything worth knowing about Frontier Command, and I was there when the Vethara killed him. I want to be precise about the Vethara, because people who have never encountered them tend to think of them as simply dangerous. They are not simply dangerous. They are a collective intelligence distributed across a neural lattice that spans, by our best estimate, 400 individual biological units at any given time. No one unit thinks. No one unit decides. The lattice decides and the units execute. What makes them genuinely alien? The thing that separates them from every other adversarial species we have encountered in 300 years of expansion is that they do not experience individual death as loss. When a unit is destroyed, the lattice notes the gap and fills it. There is no grief. There is no rage. There is only the cold arithmetic of the collective. Adjusting. They hunt by resonance signature. Every conscious mind in the galaxy produces a faint electromagnetic trace, a byproduct of electrochemical neural activity, and the Vethara lattice can detect and catalog these traces across extraordinary distances. Each individual mind has a unique signature, the way a fingerprint is unique. The Vethara do not see faces. They do not hear names. They recognize minds the way a deep space sensor array recognizes a drive signature, by frequency, by pattern, by the specific texture of a consciousness moving through space. What this means in practice is that once a Vethara lattice has cataloged your mind's signature, it can find you anywhere within sensor range. It can identify you regardless of what ship you are on, what uniform you wear, or how many years have passed. The signature changes very slowly over a lifetime. An old man and his 20-year-old self would read as nearly identical to a Vethara scanner. I did not fully understand this the day of the ambush. I understand it completely now. Marcus was running a standard sweep pattern, a long loop out toward the boundary markers, then back along the inner corridor to check for drift incursion. Nothing unusual on sensors. I was at the secondary navigation console, running calculations for the return leg, when the Vethara dropped out of what I can only describe as folded space. Not a transit corridor, not a standard approach vector. They simply appeared. 3 combat units, each roughly twice the displacement of the Ardent Lance, at a range of 800 meters. At 800 meters, railgun fire is effectively instantaneous. First salvo took out our forward shield array and the port engine cluster. The second took out communications. The third, which came 11 seconds after the first, hit the command bridge directly. Marx was standing at the primary navigation console. I was 2 meters behind him, reaching for a handhold when the deck tilted from the first impact. The explosion from the third salvo threw me into the aft bulkhead, hard enough to crack 2 ribs and render me unconscious. When I came to, the bridge was open to near vacuum through a breach in the forward viewport. Emergency containment had sealed the aft section, which is why I was alive. The rest of the bridge crew, 4 people, including Marcus, were not alive, because the containment barrier had sealed behind them, not in front of them. I do not dwell on that. I note it only so you understand what I was carrying from that day forward. The Vethara did not finish the ship. I have never been entirely certain why. My best reconstruction, years later, is that they believed the command crew was dead. Marcus was their primary target, as it turned out, though I did not know that yet, and that the remaining crew, without leadership, posed no threat worth additional weapons expenditure. The lattice is precise that way. Efficient. It does not waste effort. I got the Ardent Lance back to Heldra Station on auxiliary power with 11 surviving crew and a ship that required 4 months of dry dock repair. The Frontier Service investigation concluded that the Vethara ambush had been a targeted strike on a known patrol pattern, that someone, somehow, had provided the lattice with both our route and our timing. The investigation was unable to identify the source of that information. Port noted in dry bureaucratic language that Lieutenant Commander Samuel Riker had performed commendably under fire in saving the ship and the surviving crew. Promoted. I was given a new posting. I was left with the cold case of Marcus's death and a question that would not leave me alone. Who told the Vethara where we would be? The question was not purely personal, though it felt personal. It had operational implications. If the Vethara had an intelligence asset inside the Frontier Service, someone with access to patrol routing, then every sweep pattern in the exclusion corridor was potentially compromised. Every ship running a standard border circuit was operating with a target on it. I wrote this up in a formal assessment and submitted it to Frontier Command Intelligence within 3 weeks of returning to duty. The assessment was received, acknowledged, and filed in a division that had other priorities. I kept a copy. Over the following years, I spent whatever time I could extract from my official duties on the question. Not obsessively. I want to be clear about that, because the word obsession implies a man who has lost proportion, and I had not lost proportion. I had simply identified a specific problem that the service had declined to pursue with appropriate urgency, and I addressed it the way I addressed every other operational problem. Methodically, with patience, without expecting rapid results. I built a file. Archive requests for border incident reports going back 15 years before the ambush. Pattern analysis of Vethara engagement locations against known human patrol schedules. Cross-referencing of attack timing with service personnel who had access to routing. The work was slow. Because I was not an investigator, I was a logistics officer, and investigative databases are not designed for easy access by logistics officers. Every request for records required justification. Many requests were declined. Some were approved, and then the records arrived heavily redacted, which told me more about what was sensitive than the unredacted portions, told me about what had actually happened. What I found, across those years of slow lateral work, was a pattern without a name on it. Engagements in the exclusion corridor that had been too precise to be coincidental. Arrival times that matched service schedule windows too exactly to be sensor range alone. A cluster of incidents in a specific 3-year period that preceded and followed the Marcus ambush, and, threaded through all of it, a faint signal I could not resolve clearly. The timing of service intelligence reports on Vethara activity in the corridor showed an unusual lag in the period immediately surrounding each incident, as if someone had known to look away at the right moment. I could not identify the someone. Records did not go that deep. Not for a logistics officer working alone on archived files in the hours between his official duties. I needed access I did not have. I needed resources the service would not allocate to a cold case from 11 years ago. I needed, in some fundamental way, more time than I had, or more information than was currently available to me. The irony of that phrase did not escape me eventually. The Frontier Service had a theory. They were careful not to make it official. Careful not to put it in writing anywhere I could find. But I heard enough in enough doorways over enough months to know what they suspected. The ambush had been too precise. The Vethara had not simply found us, they had been directed. And the only people who knew that patrol route, that specific variation of the standard sweep pattern, were Marcus, me, and the senior navigator who had died in the breach. They suspected Marcus. They suspected that the man who had vouched for me, trained me, treated me like a son, had been running information to the Vethara lattice for years, that his death had been a complication. Perhaps a double cross, perhaps simply collateral damage from a collective that had no concept of honoring arrangements with individuals. They suspected that I had known, or at minimum should have known, and that my convenient survival was worth a second look. They never charged me with anything. There was nothing to charge me with, but the suspicion sat in every room I walked into. a thing I could feel without being able to address. Because to defend Marcus was to draw more attention to myself, and to concede any possibility about Marcus felt like a betrayal I could not stomach. I became, over the following years, a careful man, quiet, thorough. I kept my postings, I did my work. I did not make close friends, because close friends ask questions, and I had too many questions of my own that I could not answer. I married. Her name was Elena, and she deserved better than what I gave her, which was a man who was only partially present in any room, the rest of him back on a bridge that no longer existed, 2 meters behind a man who was already dead. We stayed together for 9 years. She left without anger, which was somehow worse than if she had been angry. I was 44 years old, assigned to a desk at Frontier Command's Logistics Division on Heldra Station, when the ghost came back. I should be precise about that word, ghost. I use it deliberately, because it is what every sensor reading told me I was looking at. A vessel that should not exist, operating in a region of space where a debris corridor made navigation nearly impossible, broadcasting a registry code that matched a decommissioned ship. My ships, the Ardent Lance, which had been stripped down and recycled 8 years prior when the service determined repair costs exceeded replacement value. The Ardent Lance, registry AS7743R, appeared on Heldra Station's long-range sensor array at approximately 0340 hours station time. It came out of the Vethara exclusion corridor. Not around it, not along the boundary, but out of the interior of it, which should have been impossible. The exclusion corridor is named for a reason. Nothing navigates through it. The Vethara transit disruption fields inside that corridor make standard drive systems fail unpredictably, and the debris density from centuries of conflict makes even manual navigation suicidal. The AS7743R was not navigating cleanly. The sensor readings showed a ship that was barely holding together, power fluctuations across multiple systems, 2 engine clusters running at partial output, hull integrity compromised in at least 3 sections. It was moving, slowly, deliberately on a direct approach vector to Heldra Station. I was not on duty. I was asleep in my quarters when the alert reached my communicator. A flag that my old registry code had been logged in the system, which I had set as a personal notification years ago, mostly out of habit, partly out of the stubborn hope that someday something connected to that ship would give me an answer. I was on the sensor deck 11 minutes later. Duty officer, a ensign named Taves, who had never seen combat, showed me the readings with the expression of a man who is afraid he has broken something by noticing it. I told him he had done correctly, that he should log it fully, and that I would need a runabout immediately. He looked at me. "You're going out there, sir?" "That ship has my name on it," I said, in a manner of speaking. He did not understand. He did not need to. I took the runabout out alone. Frontier Command protocol required a 2-person crew for any approach to an unidentified vessel. But Heldra Station at 0400 hours does not have surplus personnel standing around waiting for protocol to invoke them. I logged the deviation, noted my reasons, and proceeded. I had 11 years of unanswered questions. I was not going to wait for paperwork. The approach took 40 minutes. I spent them watching the sensor returns on the runabout's display, and what I watched did not become more reassuring with increased resolution. The Ardent Lance. And it was, unmistakably, the Ardent Lance, down to the whole geometry, and the distinctive asymmetry of the forward sensor array that had never been fully corrected after the original construction, was in worse shape than the long-range readings had suggested. Sections of the hull were simply missing. Not damaged, not breached, missing, as if they had been carefully removed, or as if time had stripped them away, which is a thought I noted and then set aside, because I was not yet ready for what that thought implied. The midsection between the aft engine mount and the secondary cargo bay had been partially replaced with plating that did not match the original spec. Darker alloy, different surface treatment, the welds visible from 300 meters as irregular seams that crossed the original hull lines at angles no shipyard on any station I knew of would have used. Repair work done in conditions where precision was a luxury. The drive signature was wrong too. Not wrong in the way of damage or malfunction, wrong in a deeper sense. A frequency signature that matched no known drive type, a resonance pattern I had never seen in 30 years of reading sensor data, as if the engine systems had been rebuilt entirely, from the drive core outward, using components that had no entry in any catalog I had access to. Tried standard hailing frequencies twice on the approach, no response. Not silence in the way of a damaged communications array. The system showed a return ping that indicated the receiver was functional. Something aboard the ship received my hail, registered it, and chose not to respond. That distinction mattered. It told me someone was aboard and paying attention. Shh. I reduced approach speed and came in along the port side at quarter speed, close enough that the runabout's proximity sensors started registering the individual hull plates. Up close, the ardent lance was something painful to see. Not the clean damage of combat. Nothing as comprehensible as that. But the specific deterioration of a ship that had been maintained under impossible circumstances for a very long time. Mismatched plating, emergency sealant around a dozen viewport frames, conduit bundles running along the exterior hull, in ways that would never have passed a standard inspection because the interior routing had apparently been compromised. Enough that external runs were the only option. Whatever had happened to this ship in the time between when I last served on it and when it appeared at the edge of the exclusion corridor, it had not been easy. I docked through a functioning airlock on the port side. Functioning being a relative term, since it cycled slowly and the pressure equalization took longer than it should have. The seal making a sound that was slightly wrong, a half tone off from what I remembered. The way a familiar voice sounds different when the person speaking it is exhausted or ill. Shh. I went aboard with a sidearm I had no real intention of using and a flashlight that proved necessary, because the corridor lighting was at roughly 30% of normal brightness. The interior of the ship smelled of deep cold and something I can only describe as burnt time. If that phrase means nothing to you, I cannot explain it better. It was the smell of something that had traveled very far, in a way that did not correspond to standard motion through space. The cold was not the residual cold of a ship running low on life support. It was something else, something the cold of hard vacuum carries when the vacuum in question is not the vacuum of the present moment. I had read, years ago, theoretical papers on the thermodynamics side effects of temporal displacement. I had read them the way you read theoretical papers when a question is important enough to chase into any territory that might hold an answer. I had not expected to encounter the phenomenon in person. I walked through my own ship and felt it recognize me in no way that a ship can recognize anyone, which is to say it did not recognize me at all, and the familiarity was entirely mine. The turn of the corridor at frame 7, the particular way the deck plating clicked underfoot at the junction between sections 3 and 4, the placement of the emergency equipment lockers, whose positions I had memorized in my first week aboard because Marcus had made all new officers memorize them. 12 years since I had last walked these corridors, and my feet remembered the route before my mind consciously directed them. I found him in the captain's ready room. He was sitting at the small desk that Marcus had used for paperwork. The same desk, the same chair which should not have been there, because the original furnishings had gone with the ship when it was decommissioned. He was reading something on a data pad, or making a show of reading it, because he had heard me come aboard, and the set of his shoulders said he had been waiting. Perhaps he had been waiting for a long time. Perhaps the entire trip had been the act of waiting, of traveling backward through time to arrive at a moment, and then waiting for the moment to catch up to him. He was old, that is the honest word. He was old in a way that 25 or 30 years produces in a man who has spent those years in hard conditions, weathered, lean, the kind of thin that comes not from illness but from a life of insufficient rest, and too much gravity at too many different values. His hair was white. The skin around his eyes was creased deeply, the marks of a man who had spent decades squinting at sensor displays in inadequate light. His hands on the data pad were steadier than I expected. His face was a map of decisions I had not yet made. I knew him immediately. I mean that without theatrical emphasis. I knew him the way you know your own reflection, the particular geometry of the jaw, the set of the eyes, the specific way the shoulders carry tension under something heavy. 44 years old. And this man was somewhere past 70, and there was no question at all about what I was looking at. "Sit down, Sam," he said. His voice was mine at a lower register, worn at the edges, the specific roughness of someone who had been talking less than usual for a very long time. I sat down. There is a particular paralysis that comes with confronting something genuinely impossible. The mind runs through every alternative explanation, hallucination, elaborate deception, mission-specific delusion, brought on by stress and insufficient sleep, and finds each one less plausible than the impossible thing itself. I had been a rational man all my life. I had been specifically a man who trusted sensor data over intuition, evidence over feeling. The sensor data on the runabout had read a genuine ship. Physical fact of this man in front of me registered through every sensory input I had. He was real. He was me. He had come from further ahead in time than I had yet traveled. "You have questions," he said. "One main one," I said. He looked at me. He already knew what the question was. He had asked it once himself, standing in a corridor on some future station, looking at an investigation file with his own name in it. He had carried the question for longer than I had. He knew its shape better than I did. After a moment, he nodded. "Didn't do it." The thing I had been carrying for 11 years, the cold weight of uncertainty, the inability to fully defend a man I had loved because I could not be completely certain, that weight did not lift. It does not lift all at once. But it shifted, and the shift was enough to make me aware of how much I had been holding. The way you become aware of a muscle's tension only when it begins to release. "Tell me," I said. He told me. Psst. He paused once in the middle of the telling to get water from a container on the desk. Plain water, nothing in it, the choice of a man who had given up anything that complicated how clearly he needed to think. He drank half of it and set it down and kept talking. He was precise. He had clearly assembled this account many times in his mind, running through it until every element was in the right order, every connection explicit. He did not want me to have to ask follow-up questions. He did not want ambiguity to leave me with any room for doubt. I listened without interrupting. That is not always easy for me. I have a tendency. Marcus noted it when I was a lieutenant. Elena noted it when we were married. Every commanding officer I have served under has noted it at some point. To want to engage with information as it arrives, to ask the clarifying question before the full picture is complete. I suppressed it. Whatever this man had come through to deliver this account, the least I could give him was my full attention. His name, our name, was Samuel Riker, and he was 71 years old, and he had spent the 27 years since the ambush doing what I had been doing for 11, trying to find the source of the information that had directed the Vethara to our position. He had more years than I did, more resources he had accumulated, more doors he had found and opened. And he had found the answer 6 months before he came back. The source was a man named Dovan Sarist. I did not recognize the name in the moment he said it. He saw that on my face and told me where I would encounter it. A name I had not yet reached. A file I had not yet opened. A connection I was 2 months away from making through the slow lateral work of a man with a desk job and too much time for thinking. He told me the shape of it in advance, because we did not have the luxury of waiting for me to reach it naturally. Sarist was a Frontier Service intelligence analyst who had been embedded with the Vethara Research Division for 6 years before the ambush. His work was legitimate. He was a genuine analyst, producing genuine assessments, but he had also been doing something else. The Vethara lattice, in its cold collective arithmetic, had long since identified that the most efficient way to reduce human naval effectiveness along the border corridor was not direct combat. The ships were too capable for that. The cost-exchange ratio did not favor the lattice. What the lattice had determined, with the remorseless logic of a distributed intelligence running long-horizon calculations, was that targeted removal of experienced commanders would degrade human capability more efficiently than direct fleet engagement. Marcus Riker had trained more frontier accounts than any other officer in the service's history. He had been doing it for 30 years. The captains who now held senior positions across the frontier fleet, 9 of them, at the time of the ambush, had all served under him. The lattice had run the calculation. Removing Marcus Riker would, over the following decade, produce a measurable reduction in the quality of frontier command response. Not a dramatic collapse, not a single devastating blow. The lattice did not think in those terms. A slow, steady degradation, the way you weaken metal by removing one small stress cycle at a time. Sarist had provided the patrol route and the timing. He had done it believing, as collaborators sometimes do, that the relationship was mutual. That the information he passed would buy safety for himself. Perhaps some form of preferential treatment from the collective when the long game eventually concluded. The lattice had no concept of honoring that arrangement. When Sarist's usefulness as a source diminished, when the research division rotated him out and he no longer had access to patrol scheduling, the lattice simply stopped responding to his contact attempts. He was a tool that had been used and set down. He had spent the following 2 decades living with what he had done, and the fact that no one knew he had done it. He had a career. He had a family. He had a small house on a station that I would never have visited without this conversation pointing me there. My old self had found Saris 6 months ago, had tracked the information chain backward through 27 years of archived intelligence assessments and border incident reports, looking for the specific pattern of foreknowledge that would identify a source inside the service, had found the single analyst whose report timing, whose access windows, whose assigned history all aligned around the ambush date, like a set of coordinates that pointed at one location. He had gone to confront Sarist and found him dead. Not recently dead. Dead for 3 weeks, which, when my older self checked, corresponded to a date 4 days after Sarist had apparently been contacted by someone else conducting the same investigation. Someone inside the current Vethara liaison office who had noticed unusual inquiry activity in the archived files and understood what it meant. The lattice had cleaned up its old account. 33 years after the ambush, it had found its former asset and eliminated him before he could talk. So the evidence is gone, I said. Sarist is gone, he said. The evidence isn't. Found his records. Not the official ones. The ones he kept because he was a careful man who believed in insurance. Did archive. Dead drop location on a station he visited twice a year. I have the file. He slid the data pad across the desk. I looked at it without touching it. You came back 27 years to give me a file, I said. I came back 27 years because the file isn't enough, he said. There's a Vethara command node currently operating in the Heldra system. It's been here for 9 months, running what the lattice calls a resonance suppression operation, which means it's here to eliminate specific mind signatures that the collective has flagged as threats to border operations. Your signature is on that list, Sam. Has been for 11 years. The reason you're still alive is that the lattice prefers efficiency, and until now, eliminating you has carried a cost exchange that didn't favor it. You're a desk officer. You're not actively threatening border operations. You're contained. He paused. That changes in approximately 72 hours. When you open a file that will lead you to Sarist's records through official channels. The same path I took, 27 years later. But you're closer to the source, and you'll reach it faster than I did. When you open that file, the lattice's monitoring protocols will flag you as an active threat, and the command node in system will act. So you came back to warn me, I said. I came back to finish it, he said. The command node is a physical installation, not a ship. A fixed installation, anchored to the debris field on the far side of the exclusion corridor boundary. The service doesn't know it's there. I know where it is because I spent 27 years figuring it out. And I have the coordinates, and I have a weapons solution, but I don't have the authorization codes to fire. The Ardent Lance is operating outside formal service structure. A shot from this vessel would be logged as an unidentified aggressor strike. It would not be followed up with the investigation that Sarist's records require. I understood then, or I began to. You need me to make the shot, I said. I need a commissioned frontier service officer to make the shot. Yes, he looked at me steadily. And then I need that officer to take Sarist's records to the sector admiral and open an official inquiry. With the node gone, the lattice loses its enforcement capability in this system. With the inquiry open, the chain of information leads back to the current Vethara liaison office and whoever flagged the archive access that got Sarist killed. I looked at him for a long time. Happens to you, I said. After, he did not look away. I came back through an unstable transit corridor using a drive technology that won't exist for another 2 decades. Every hour this ship spends in the present timeline, the drive integrity degrades. The ship will phase out. Not catastrophically. It won't explode. It won't damage anything. It will simply cease to register in the present. Wherever it goes after that, I can't tell you precisely. And you, I said. I'm part of the ship, he said. Ever the ship goes. He said it the way you say a thing that you have lived with long enough that it has stopped being frightening and become simply factual. He had known this when he made the trip. He had come anyway. I sat with that for a while. The hum of the ship around us was different from what I remembered. Quieter in some frequencies, louder in others. The sound of machinery that had been repaired too many times with whatever was available. The smell of cold and burnt time. Marcus's name, I said finally. Will be cleared, he said. Yes. That's why I made the trip. The weapons solution and the inquiry would have happened eventually. I'd have found a way. But you needed to know about Marcus. And I needed to be the one to tell you. Because there was no other way to make you certain. There it was. Real reason. Not the tactical objective, not the command node, not the inquiry. A man who had spent 30 years unable to fully defend someone he had loved, who had found his evidence too late and too far down the line to do anything, but come back and give it to the version of himself who still had time to use it. Put up. He stayed seated. I'll need the coordinates, I said, and the weapons solution, and the Sarist file. Already transferred to the runabout system, he said. I did it while you were docking. Of course he had. He had 27 additional years of knowing how I think. One more question, I said. He waited. Do we get it right? Does the inquiry actually land? Do the people who ran Sarist, the ones currently in the liaison office, do they face it? He took a moment. Not because he was deciding whether to tell me, I think, but because he was deciding how exactly to say it. Takes 4 years, he said. It's not clean. 3 people in the liaison office are implicated. 2 are convicted. 1 dies before trial. The Vethara don't stop running operations because of it. They're a collective, Sam. There's no arresting a collective. But the specific infrastructure they've built for resonance suppression in the Heldra corridor gets dismantled and stays dismantled for at least a decade. That's what we get. That's something, I said. It's enough, he said. I believe it's enough. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. I left him in the ready room. I walked back through the dim corridors of the ship I had once commanded, noting the changes. The repairs made with mismatched plating. The modifications to conduit runs that had been altered to accommodate systems I didn't fully recognize. The small personal marks of a long occupation. A photograph fixed to a corridor bulkhead that I did not stop to examine because I was not yet ready to know whose photograph it was. A set of handwritten navigational notes in handwriting. That was mine at a different age. The letters more compressed. The hand of someone who had spent years writing in cramped quarters. I went back to the runabout. The coordinates were there. The weapons solution was there. Sarist's file was there. Encrypted under a cipher that my older self had apparently trusted my current self to break. Or perhaps trusted that I would not need to break it until the right moment. I sat in the runabout for a few minutes looking at the data. The command node was 7 light minutes from Heldra Station. Anchored in the debris field, where the exclusion corridor boundary ran closest to the station's patrol perimeter. Sheet. It had been sitting there for 9 months. Tier service sensors swept that region routinely and had seen nothing, which told me something about the cloaking capability involved. But the coordinates my older self had provided included the specific sensor frequency at which the installation's cloak degraded slightly, a vulnerability presumably discovered through decades of incremental intelligence work. And at that frequency, if I knew where to look, and I did know where to look, a frontier service frigate with a targeting solution already calculated could put a railgun salvo through the node's primary structure before the lattice had time to respond. The problem was that I did not have a frontier service frigate. I had a runabout designed for short-range personnel transfers, with a sensor array capable of finding the frequency vulnerability and 1 light armament railgun rated for anti-debris clearing work. Anti-debris clearing work. 1 small railgun designed to punch through ice and rock. The command node, according to the intelligence in the file, was constructed from Vethara composite materials. Dense. Layered. resistant to impact in the way that all Vethara physical installations were resistant to impact. The lattice did not build things to fail under reasonable stress. I ran the calculation 3 times. The mass of the projectiles, the velocity at range, the structural rating of the composite materials. I checked my older self's weapons solution against my own assessment. He had already done this calculation. The notation at the bottom of the solution read, simply, 1 shot, midpoint of the tertiary power conduit, running along the installation's ventral axis. The single weakest point in the composite shell, where 2 layers met at an angle that created a stress fracture vulnerability. At standard frigate railgun energy, you would need 3 or 4 shots. At anti-debris clearing railgun energy, if the shot was precise enough. If the targeting was within a margin of error of less than 0.1%, the round would penetrate the outer layer at the fracture point and reach the power conduit directly. 1 shot, 0.5% margin, from a runabout. I have been asked since whether I was afraid at that moment. I find the question genuinely hard to answer. I was aware that I might miss and that missing would mean the node had been alerted and would have time to prepare a response. I was aware that even if I hit, the response from the lattice would be rapid and that I was operating alone without backup. Was aware that I was sitting in a vehicle designed for ferrying personnel across a station approach corridor, preparing to fire on a Vethara military installation. What I mostly felt was a particular quality of focus, the kind that comes when you have been carrying a question for a very long time, and you can see, finally, the precise mechanisms by which the question will be answered. Not the answer itself yet. You do not receive the answer until after the action, but the mechanism, the specific physical act that will resolve what has been unresolved. Ran the targeting solutions through a 3rd time and made 1 small correction to the bearing. The debris field had a detectable drift pattern, consistent and predictable, and over the 40 minutes I had been on station, the installation's position had shifted by slightly more than I had initially calculated. I adjusted for it. The margin of error on the corrected solution came to 0.28%, better than the 0.5% I needed. I thought about the other thing my older self had said, which I have not mentioned yet because it is not directly part of the operational account, but which I was thinking about in those final minutes before the shot. He had said, when I asked him about Elena, she was at the ceremony. When Marcus's name went on the wall, she came and she stood at the back and she left before the end. And I didn't speak to her, and I have thought about that more times than I can count. He had said it without being asked about it. He had brought it up himself, which told me it was still present in him, still unresolved in a way that the Marcus question was no longer unresolved. Because the Marcus question had an answer and the Elena question did not. Not the kind of answer that changes anything. She had left without anger. That was the fact. There was no action that could be taken on it, no file to open, no node to destroy. I filed that observation in the same place I kept the other things I did not yet know how to act on, and I focused on the targeting solution. The moment before I fired, I did something that probably seems irrational for a man of my particular temperament and training. I thought about Marcus Riker standing at the navigation console, not in the moment of the ambush, not the explosion, not the containment seal closing, but earlier. On a normal patrol day, unremarkable, the kind of day that constitutes 95% of any service career, standing at the console with a cup of whatever he was drinking that day, looking at the sensor display with the patient attention of a man who has done this work for 30 years, and still takes it seriously, because the alternative is to stop taking it seriously, and that was not in him. He was careful in the way that genuinely capable people are careful, not cautiously, not timidly, but with full attention given to what deserved full attention. He thought that precision was a form of respect. He thought that doing your work correctly was a statement about what you believed the work was worth. I fired. The round traveled in silence. There is no sound in space, which is a fact I have always known, and which still, in moments of high pressure, strikes me as strange. The absence of the expected noise. A projectile into space at velocity, and there is nothing. Just the slight recoil in the runabout's frame, and then the sensor display showing a moving point that is your round and a stationary point that is your target. and the geometry between them collapsing at a rate determined entirely by physics. I watched the sensor return as the projectile crossed the distance. I did not pray. I am not a man who prays. But I held the image of Marcus at the navigation console. And I held the data my older self had handed me. And I held 11 years of slow, careful work in cold archive rooms, looking for the shape of something I could not quite see. And I waited for the physics to reach its conclusion. The round struck the ventral fracture point at a deviation of 0.3% from center. Within the 0.5% margin, the power conduit ruptured. The installation's internal systems went from fully operational to zero power in approximately 4 seconds, which is what happens when the main conduit fails in a structure that has no secondary power backup, because the lattice had not anticipated a threat capable of hitting that specific point at that specific angle from a vessel that read as a personnel transfer craft. The lattice's limitation, the precise arithmetic of a collective intelligence that calculates on the basis of known capabilities. A runabout's armament is in the catalog. A runabout's armament is rated for anti-debris work. The catalog does not contain an entry for the targeting solution my older self spent 27 years developing. Hexagonal structure sat dark in the debris field, no response. No secondary systems coming online. No lattice response from the exclusion corridor. Dead. I sat there for a moment. Then I turned the runabout back toward Heldra Station, because I had an encrypted file to decrypt, and a sector admiral to wake up at an inconvenient hour. On the way back, I opened a secondary channel to the Ardent Lance's position and ran a sensor sweep. The ship was still there, barely. The return was fainter than it had been 2 hours ago. The hull signature at reduced definition, the power readings lower, the drive signature beginning to show the frequency drift that my older self had described. I held the channel open for a while without transmitting. There was nothing to say that had not been said. He knew the shot had connected. The sensor readings would have shown him that much. He knew I was on my way back. He knew what came next. Because he had lived what came next, even if he had lived it differently, along a line of events that had not included this conversation. I thought about what it costs to come back to the version of yourself you used to be. The version that still has the questions you have spent a lifetime answering. The version that is still carrying the weight you eventually set down, but not yet, not for a long time yet. To sit across from that version and give him what you know, knowing that the giving of it is the last thing you will do. A man who had spent 30 years in grief, traveling to the edge of what was physically possible, to clear the name of someone who had been dead for 3 decades, and could not be brought back by any of it. To clear the name not for the dead man's sake, because the dead man would not know, for his own sake, the sake of the version of himself still young enough to defend the truth while it mattered. The sensor return faded at 6621 hours station time. Not a sudden loss of signal, a gradual diminishment, the way a radio source sounds when it moves beyond reception range. There was no debris, no explosion, no event. The Ardent Lance was present, and then it was less present, and then it was not present. And the debris field filled the space where it had been exactly as the debris field had filled that space before. I docked at Heldra Station at Eero 648. I went directly to the Sector Admiral's quarters. Heldra Station had a resident flag officer, an admiral named Kostath, who had a reputation for thorough investigations and a strong like of being woken before 0700. I woke him at 648 and told him I had evidence of a long-term Vethara intelligence operation inside the service and a decommissioned installation that his next patrol sweep would find destroyed in the exclusion corridor debris field, and that I needed him to listen to me carefully before I showed him the file, because what I was about to tell him was going to require context. He listened. He was good at listening, whatever else people said about his temper. At first, conversation lasted 3 hours. Stath was as a man who had spent 40 years developing an allergy to stories that did not hold together under scrutiny, and he tested this one from every angle he could find. I let him. The file held together because it was real, because Sarist had been a careful man with an operational analyst's understanding of the value of documentation. And what he had kept was not a confession but something more useful. A complete record of every contact with the lattice, Every piece of information passed, every response received, cross-referenced with service patrol records, in a way that left no reasonable alternative interpretation. He had kept it as insurance. He had kept it because some part of him knew that the lattice would eventually stop needing him, and he wanted leverage he never had the chance to use. The file also contained one piece of evidence that Kostas found particularly compelling: a set of encoded communications between Sarist and an unidentified contact inside the current Vethara liaison office, dated 34 days before Sarist died. The contact had noticed unusual archive inquiry activity. Someone pulling old border incident reports in a pattern that indicated they were reconstructing the information chain from the ambush forward, and had flagged it to the lattice. Sarist's death, 3 weeks later, was the result. The inquiry had a starting point that did not depend entirely on the file. It had a fresh crime: the murder of a current service citizen by lattice operatives acting through a human intermediary. That was not a cold case from 33 years ago. That was recent, actionable, and exactly the kind of material a thorough admiral could build a formal proceeding on. Kostas authorized the inquiry within the week. He also authorized a formal patrol sweep of the exclusion corridor debris field, which found the destroyed installation exactly where I said it would be. The analysis of the wreckage confirmed Vethara manufacture and operational capability consistent with the resonance suppression function my older self had described. The question of how a decommissioned service runabout had managed to find and destroy a cloaked Vethara oscillation using clearing gun armament was noted in the investigation record and listed as a matter requiring separate examination. That examination went nowhere, because the relevant targeting data had been on a disposable chip that I disposed of, and the sensor logs from the runabout showed nothing more than a patrol sweep of the area, consistent with a logistics officer investigating an anomalous sensor return. I was not entirely comfortable with that omission. I am still not entirely comfortable with it, but I had considered what would happen if I filed a complete and accurate account. If I reported that my 71-year-old future self had arrived on a ship using drive technology that would not exist for 2 decades and handed me a 33-year-old investigation file, and I had concluded that the investigation would rapidly become about me rather than about Sarist and the liaison office. Whatever the true account was worth as truth, it was not worth that. I kept the account in a secure personal file. I am putting it here now because there is no longer any inquiry it can derail. The inquiry took 4 years. That was accurate. 3 people in the liaison office, 2 convictions, 1 death before trial. The corridor operations were audited and restructured. The resonance suppression infrastructure was dismantled, and monitoring protocols were put in place to detect future attempts. Marcus Riker's record was formally cleared in the 2nd year of the inquiry, when the file evidence established definitively that the ambush's logistical support had come from Sarist and not from the Ardent Lance's command crew. The service issued a posthumous commendation. His name was added to the memorial wall at Frontier Command Headquarters, where it had been conspicuously absent. I attended the ceremony. There were not many people there. Marcus had outlived most of his contemporaries, and the ambush had been far enough back that the junior officers he had trained had their own memorials to attend, their own old griefs. Elena came. She had heard about the inquiry, had followed it, and she came to the ceremony without announcement, stood at the back, and left before the official portion ended. I did not speak to her. There was nothing to say that would have adequately covered the distance, but she came. I noted that I have held it. In the months after the ceremony, I found myself thinking about a specific detail from the conversation with my older self that I had set aside during the operational urgency of that day. He had mentioned the photograph in the corridor. I had not stopped to look at it. I had noted it, noted my own reluctance to look, and kept walking. Later, when I thought about it, I understood why I had not looked, and why he had not mentioned what was in it. Some things you find out in the right order. He had given me what I needed. He had left me the rest to find outs for myself in the time I had left that he did not. There is a version of this story in which I tell you that I sought out Elena after the ceremony. I did not. I thought about it for a year. I drafted what I wanted to say several times and found each draft inadequate. Eventually, I concluded that a man who needs a year to draft what he wants to say to someone has not yet found the right thing to say, and that finding it requires living until it is true, rather than constructing it out of the material of what he wishes were true. Kept that file too. It is not ready yet. I am 61 years old now. I still work for the service. Not at a logistics desk, not anymore. After the inquiry, they gave me back a ship, for one. A full-class patrol cruiser, with 42 crew and a weapons load that would have seemed extraordinary to the lieutenant commander, who limped the Ardent Lance back to Heldra Station on auxiliary power. I run the deep border surveys, the long sweeps into the exclusion corridor boundary zones, the routes that require someone who knows exactly how the Vethara lattice thinks, because he has spent his career studying it. I have never encountered another command node. That does not mean they have stopped building them. It means they are more careful now. I think sometimes about the ship that came out of the exclusion corridor in the dark of the morning, and what it took to get there. The drive technology, the unstable transit corridor, the degrading hull. A journey that could not have been made in the normal sense of travel. Not a matter of pointing the ship and engaging the drive. Something more difficult than that. More costly. Through space that did not welcome the transit. I think about the man who made that journey and what he knew he was trading for it. There is a version of this story in which I tell you that I understood in the moment the Ardent Lance faded from the sensor return exactly what I had been given. I did not. Understanding that kind of gift takes time. It takes the years of doing the work that the gift made possible. The inquiry, the cleared name, the testimony, the slow reconstruction of a truth that had been buried for 33 years. You understand the weight of what was given to you by living with what it allowed you to do. What I was given was certainty. That is the simplest way to say it. A man who knew what I did not know, traveling an impossible distance to put certainty in my hands at the moment I needed it, and then stepping back into wherever the corridor leads, and not asking for anything in return. Riker did not betray anyone. He was a man who taught other people how to be good at hard things, and he was murdered by a collective intelligence that understood, with cold arithmetic precision, exactly how valuable that made him. I am 61 years old, and I patrol the border he spent his career protecting. And on the good days, when the ship runs clean and the corridor is quiet, and the crew does their work with the specific competence of people who have been trained well, I think that the arithmetic runs in our direction too, always, not without cost. In the long calculation, the one that runs further than any single engagement or any single loss, we keep adding to our side of the ledger. That is the specifically human thing, not the weapons, not the ships, not the adaptability or the stubbornness or the dark humor, though those count too. The specifically human thing is that we carry our dead forward with us. We hold them in the account. We do not let the lattice's arithmetic be the final word on what they cost. Kiss is on the wall at Frontier Command now. That is enough. I believe it is enough.